Welcome back, Hidden History Happy Hour fans, and welcome to our special Thursday edition of the Happy Hour, in which we introduce an occasional new figure we like to call the It Could Have Happened That Way episode, Alex.
Yep, good plan and good thinking. Some speculation necessarily involved in this one.
I tried to come up with a good way to mark this new feature. I convened the same focus groups and branding experts that you use to develop the title of your new book, More Lessons from History, available for pre-order. And I think, Alex, if I'm not mistaken, a number of the stories in More Lessons of History our fans might have first heard right here at the Hidden History Happy Hour.
Correct.
So to celebrate the occasion, I came up with an orange shirt. That was honestly the best I could do.
Okay.
But we'll see how Thursday goes, fans. We look to hear from you how you enjoyed it. Now, Alex, you know, here on the Hidden History Happy Hour, we love our Blue Run bourbon.
Yep.
I've been inspired, though, by your going local there at home with your providers. And so today I'm going to enjoy a bespoke whiskey made just for my little family here on the Puget Sound. This is Heritage Distillery. And you can show up and pay a little money, and they give you your own cask, wooden cask, and you mix and match and flavor it the way you want. So this one is...
How much did you vary your preferences from the kind of generic?
A little bit. So what they did is they blind taste test you on like their 3 or 4 different whiskeys that they make. Then you mix those together, and then they say, would you like to add a little vanilla? Would you like to put a clove in here? Would you like to put cocoa in, which I resisted? But then you let it distill as long as you like. You tell them what proof you want. And next thing you know, you have a bespoke whiskey. Ours is named after our 2 dogs. It's called Whip It Good.
I like it.
And our next cask is going to be called You Must Whip It.
Well, less interestingly, I'm drinking a beer.
Cheers, friend.
You win. Cheers. Cheers.
All right. Cheers. So, as people know, as an intelligence officer, I always approach history, Alex, a little skeptically. I always like to say, here's what the stated facts are, but do they maybe not quite add up in this point, on this point or that point? And I want to take a closer look at these and understand why. And I must say, the first story we have today is actually, Alex, the first story I ever read when I purchased Lessons from History, also still available. Because it looked to me like one of those stories.
Well, you crazy maverick. You read chapter 2 first. You make your own rules. Okay. Well, so
tell us about Lord Haw Haw.
I will. And this is a story. When it starts, everyone thinks I know this, but you get to the end, always everyone thinks I didn't know that. Exactly. So Lord Haw Haw, real name William Joyce, was the voice of the Nazis on air during World War II, broadcast into my country, into Great Britain. And he was, of course, the last person in my country executed for treason as a result. And that's so far so well known. Less well known, there's a little town called Flensburg, which did nothing to deserve this being inflicted on it. It was the last capital of the Third Reich. As the Germans retreated and after Berlin was conquered, it's where Dönitz and co. were. It's right up by the German border with Denmark, which in itself, by the way, has moved a few times over the years.
Yes.
Anyway, there was a British intelligence unit kind of mopping up the last Nazis around that patch. And an officer in that unit accosted this guy he saw in the distance gathering wood or foraging or something, and talked to him. And this British officer recognized Haw Haw's voice from his accent, right? So that the voice that he had used to kind of undermine Britain and insinuate the worst things into our country was what gave him away. Now, specifically, that officer was called Geoffrey Perry. That's what we called him. But he was born Horst Pinschauer. And he was a Jewish German who had fled the Nazis and signed up with Great Britain to fight against Nazi Germany, which is, I think, perfect, but it gets better.
Yes.
Perry Pinschauer claimed that he thought Haw Haw was going for his gun, which, by the way, he didn't have. He thought Haw Haw was going for his gun. So he shot him. And specifically, he shot him in the arse. Or rather, he shot him through the arse. 4 wounds. Entry into one buttock, exit out of that buttock. Entry into the second buttock, exit out of the second buttock, 1 bullet. Now, I suggest that takes a high level of accuracy. It's not life-threatening. He got his prisoner, but it is deeply humiliating and painful.
You might even say, Alex, cheeky.
It's very doubly cheeky. Right. So that's part 1. Part 2 is where it might have happened this way comes in, because I owe this part to a British author called Nigel Farndale, who's researched this, and it really does stand up in a non-conspiracy theory way. Joyce, properly evidenced, not fantasist, had these pre-war connections, not during the war. No suggestion we were running him as an agent.
Joyce is Lord Haw Haw, just
Lord Haw Haw, before the war, had genuinely bottomed out connections to the British intelligence service, MI5. And at his trial at the Old Bailey, at which that might have been extremely useful for him to bring forth, he did not mention this. He didn't give evidence at all. He didn't have his barrister put it to anybody, despite the fact that he had nothing else going for him, basically.
Yeah.
That might have been what saved him from the gallows. And it's difficult to think of an explanation for that, especially given the inevitable consequences of his silence was death, other than the possibility that he had made a deal with the prosecutors and with the British state not to raise it, and therefore to avoid the considerable embarrassment that would be visited upon post-war Britain if he did. And I think he did that. And this is speculation, and Farndale's speculation, first of all, not mine, but speculation is, which I believe, is that he did it in return for them not prosecuting his wife, who was herself a rabid pro-Nazi, as guilty as he was, as guilty of collaboration as he was, as guilty of supporting the enemy and assisting the enemy as he was. And she went scot-free, or at least free enough to live until 1972, drinking herself to death. And my point is that, and there's not much to admire about Haw Haw, William Joyce, but I think that even knowing what it was going to mean for his future if he were to keep silent about his past, Joyce, I think, struck a deal, his life for hers.
Is there any sense that women were treated differently by the British authorities at that moment? So that might have explained it.
Maybe a little bit. And clearly he was more high profile, right?
Yeah.
But they were right across the Allied world. There were plenty of women who were being prosecuted, being collaborators, and even if not killed, even if not executed, they were getting sentences. And we remember, of course, the humiliations visited, especially on French women who'd been too close to the Germans during occupation. But there were plenty of collaborating Brits who were locked up during the course of the war, who were women, plenty were prosecuted. So no, it can't be that. There was something else to it. And given how high profile Haw Haw was, you would think, doing his wife who'd gone over to Germany with him, gone to the Germans and so forth, you'd think that would help them. I mean, there was all manner of things offered by his defense at trial about whether he was actually a subject of the crown because he had applied for a British passport. Did he get it? Was it valid at that time? And so forth. You might have thought, he was a spy for us, was the kind of thing that got mentioned. In fact, you might have mentioned it if you were the prosecution and saying, well, if it came out, then if you were spying for us, it demonstrates you were British and that's where you owed your loyalties. In fact, but instead there was a conspiracy of silence around that salient fact. And it just leads me to believe he did a deal.
Yeah, well, I guess there's a possibility the prosecutors didn't know that either, but I think your explanation is the most plausible. Also, I can tell you from personal experience, an echo, I guess it's not an echo from history. It's like retrofitting corroboration for your theory. And it goes like this. Up until probably Edward Snowden, a guy called Aldrich Ames was the most infamous American spy. He was a CIA officer. He betrayed a large number of American agents in Russia and the Soviet Union who were then killed. No question about it.
Nixon was right.
I was actually on the prosecution and damage assessment team in Ames's case back in the 90s. And you could imagine that the Central Intelligence Agency might have lobbied the government pretty hard to get the death penalty for him, just to send a message that we take this stuff seriously. And you got 8 of our agents killed and you got to pay the price. Well, I can't officially speculate on what happened, but he made a deal for life imprisonment, and his wife, who was deeply involved in the financing and the movement of money and the hiding of money, was not prosecuted at all.
So that's, first of all, I'm going to, because I interposed wrongly and said Nixon was right. I was thinking of Alger Hiss, and you talk about Ulrich Ames, because Hiss was a spy and Nixon supported the Whittaker Chambers.
Aldrich Ames, totally different case, much later.
Yeah, I know. That's why I had to pause when you said you were on the case. I was like, you were way too young. You were way too young. And then I realized I had the wrong guy. So yeah, I was thinking of Alger Hiss. Ulrich Ames is interesting to me. Was he the guy who shocked Gordievsky? Is Ames? I
don't
think
believe
Ames,
so.
Okay, all right. Then I'll stop
although
trying to.
we should look that up, but let's say he was, for the sake of argument. What would that tell you?
The point would have been that we've done a story about Oleg Gordievsky in
Yeah.
my book, and we're going to tell it in the podcast one day. One of the bravest and most valuable, highest level sources the British ever had, and he was given up by an American spy for the Russians. The Russians had worked out that somebody was against them, and somebody in your intelligence services shopped Gordievsky to the Russians. Who was then caught himself as a spy, and I thought it was Ames, but I mean,
well, actually,
let my
Alex,
memory did mislead me.
This is one of the few times on our podcast I'm going to have to do something highly obnoxious and say I can't talk about that. But I will say, whether it was Gordievsky or not, he knew he was sending multiple agents to their deaths, and he did it for money.
Right.
Plain and simple. But it was a little bit more complicated, like these things always are. There was a little bit of his ego. They were able to convince him that if you'd only been in the KGB, you would have been much higher up, and the Americans are ignoring your value and all this. But it was mostly money.
The more you talk about it, and maybe you can't say, but I'm increasingly sure he was the guy who shot Gordievsky, who was one of the bravest men ever to live. Voluntarily,
we'll definitely do Gordievsky
Great
soon.
Story.
Inspiration.
Right, so that's Lord Haw Haw.
Yeah. And is he remembered by modern day? Well, let me back up for a second. So he must have been one of the most hated Nazis in your country, right?
Oh, very much so, because even the worst of the leading German Nazis were at least their Nazis. This was one of ours. This was a British guy who decided to go over. That was absolutely resented. I mean, the Germans had, I think it was called the St. George Battalion, which was Brits fighting for them. There were like 10 of them, right? And they were like sub 60 IQ type total idiots who were just kind of. But Haw Haw was different. Haw Haw was a charlatan and quite a bright guy, and just threw his lot in with them. But as my story implies, he was up to something else before that as well.
And I'll just ask for our viewers and listeners the obvious question I asked when I first read this story, which is the historian that inspired this story. There's no theory that he actually was undercover the whole time, operating under British control.
Absolutely not. I know, absolutely not. It's just that he had done some work for MI5 before the war. And indeed, if you were really going all out to try and save himself from the noose, I suppose he could have tried to run. The point you make, that he'd actually gone, I mean, talk about deep cover. He'd gone truly deep cover in order to get secrets from the Germans. But no, there was absolutely no suggestion of that in reality.
Yeah. Well, so just as evil as we always thought, but possibly did one semi-honorable thing at the end. I guess it's not semi, it's honorable if he did that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And actually, if you can see someone in history with a black heart who had one moment of something, it's still worth noting.
Well, that's Lord Haw Haw. That's one of my favorite stories from the book. And I like this. I like the alternate history. I think we should keep that up, and let's just keep that up. So also from Lessons from History, I believe chapter 17 is the story of, now I'm going to use the pronunciation I found on the interweb, so we'll probably get in trouble. But the way I was told by the world to pronounce his name is Jan Masaryk, which sounds like the last way you should pronounce it. In any event, he's another historical figure whose death may not have been exactly as it seemed.
Right, and we're going to cover all bases by me using a different pronunciation. I'm going to say Jan Masaryk. I think to me it must be Jan. Is Czech, but
seems like it should be.
Right, so Jan Masaryk, if that's his name, was the son of the founding president of Czechoslovakia. And totally coincidentally, his civil service career really took off after his dad took office. And he was posted to the Czechoslovakian embassy in the United States after the First World War. He became long-serving aide to the Foreign Secretary, Edward Beneš, who succeeded his father as president. And then he became the long-standing Czech ambassador to the UK, which is part of, if he's remembered for things here, it's because he was a well-regarded ambassador here. Whilst he was in the United Kingdom, the war commenced, the Second World War, and he became foreign minister in the Czechoslovakian government in exile, which was in London during the Second World War. And when the conflict finished, he returned to his country, which was, of course, under Soviet occupation post-1945. And he stayed in that foreign minister role until after the Czech communist government was formed in 1946. And in 1948, some of the non-communists in government tried to force new elections. Excuse me, when I say he remained in it until after, I mean the communist government was formed in it in 46. He continued to be foreign minister. A bunch of the non-communists in government tried to force new elections by resigning, and they failed. And he was basically the only non-communist or non-fellow traveler in a prominent public role. And on the one hand, his friends would have accused him of being a useful idiot. Soviets might have, it was useful to the Soviets and the puppets. And then when he endorsed the idea of Czechoslovakia taking money from the West under the Marshall Plan, which implied that the beneficence of the Soviet Union wasn't enough, that protection from Mother Russia wasn't enough,
and they might be tilting.
Right. Then it was suddenly very bad from their perspective, and this guy who they'd allowed to stick around was regarded far less positively. So conveniently for those people, supposedly promptly committed suicide, jumping from a window in his official apartment in the rather baroque Czernin Palace in Prague, to which he'd been confined with a whole new set of staff deprived his normal retainers since he'd had his outburst about the Marshall Plan.
I feel an accept coming.
Yeah, well, if you detect skepticism in my voice, you're right, because there are, let's say, reasons for skepticism about this suicide explanation. And I count the following points in that, Brian. One, there were deep scratch marks all around the window frame, consistent with someone, for example, desperately clinging to life against somebody trying to chuck them out the window. Witnesses, secondly, had passed through the courtyard a quarter of an hour before his body was found in it. And you might think they'd have noticed a body splayed out on the cobbles.
Much less flying out the window.
Much less flying, if that's had what happened. But the reason I mention that is that the police doctor who carried out the preliminary examination said that he died at least 2 hours before he was found. So, quarter of an hour before that, witnesses go through, body wasn't there. Police doctors say 2 hours before this person was dead. Thirdly, his own doctor was not allowed to attend the post-mortem. And if you've got a case as high profile as this, you want to say, we've got nothing to hide. Come along. You can witness the post-mortem, but that's not what they said. The doctor who actually undertook it had demonstrated his willingness to, let's say, work flexibly with unpleasant regimes by being a long-standing Czechoslovakian servant of the Nazis, right? So next, he supposedly jumped from a small, narrow window set high up in the wall, which is hard to get to and hard to get through. His own bedroom window in the palace was large and much easier to get through. And he apparently chose that rather unpleasant way to die and rather difficult to do, despite the gun and the drugs that he had in his chambers. So, I mean, it's a pretty bizarre set of explanations. Now, some of his family said that, he just never would have killed himself. His great hero in his life was his father, the first president of his country. His father had famously taken a public position that suicide was a coward's way of escape, that you must never take your own life. And last of all, if it was actually suicide, then it would be the second, definitely not by defenestration, death by jumping from a window by an awkward government minister, as the former Minister of Justice had just done so, or not, before Masaryk supposedly did. So it
was probably a copycat.
Yeah, well, quite. So my dear friend Columbo, I think, would be one more thinging all over this case. So little wonder that with the dark humor that was so prevalent amongst those who lived under the Soviet jackboot and the enduring communist regimes, the joke in Czechoslovakia was that Masaryk was a man so tidy, he closed the window behind himself after he jumped. Now, after the Prague Spring in 68, when the authorities were trying to reassure people about things, they concluded that the incident was an accident. So now it wasn't suicide anymore, but it was an accident, and it definitely wasn't murder. So first explanation, suicide. Second explanation, accident. Communism falls in the East, 1990s. Third investigation, he was murdered. So it went from being a suicide to being an accident to being a murder. And a fourth inquiry held by the police in the 2000s also said murder, but neither of those inquiries said by whom. So much has been revealed, and unexplained incidents, finally understood by personal testimony and archive material, have become available after the fall of communism in other examples.
Yeah.
But despite this case being so high profile in his country, Masaryk's death is not amongst them. His murder remains unsolved to this day. The police reopened the investigation in 2019, which is, before my book came out. And so when the book came out, I said no findings yet. So it was the first time in my book about history I said, watch this space. I can tell listeners that investigation concluded during coronavirus with in 2021 with the conclusion all of the options are possible. Could have been a suicide, could have been an accident, could have been murder. Not going to say who. So actually, the jury is absolutely still out.
And there's no way to refute the finding that it could have been any of those options.
What do you do, right?
So I think, first of all, this needs an afterword in more lessons from history, but also, doesn't it circle us back to a discussion we've had with Mike Cole and with Professor Buzzkill and with a lot of our guests, that what we think of as history is pretty questionable until we get the time machine, right?
Right. And when you do get the time machine, a lot of physicists who's one of their favorite games is speculating about this stuff, is that you could only take your time machine back to the time that time machines were invented. So it would be very useful to use time machines up to, I don't know, back to 2100 when time machines were invented, but you couldn't take it back before that. So the mists of time will remain concealed even from our successors who've worked out how to breach time.
But I would say this is a feature, not a bug, for the Hidden History Happy Hour, because more It Could Have Happened That Way episodes are now destined to be dropped on Thursdays, I believe.
Oh, yes.
So much to unpack there. Well, Alex, I'm more of a Jim Rockford, Thomas Magnum kind of guy, but I respect your views on Columbo. But even, I think, not to disparage the bona fides education wise of Thomas Magnum, I think even Magnum would have to have asked the question,
right?
And this is what I ask as a counterintelligence officer, what would be the earlier stuff is interesting and it's titillating history, right? But the most fascinating thing to me is the story is why, after the wall has fallen, after the Czech Republic is independent, do we still not have the whole story?
Well, of course, some people will have gone to their graves with the facts, and some people, if there are facts to be found, right? Look, perhaps one of the explanations offered along the way was correct. Maybe he did kill himself. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was murder by someone who's now dead and they can't work it out, and it wasn't, the state doing it. I doubt all of those explanations.
Yeah. By the way, the least plausible one, based on the way you tell the story, is the accident.
Yeah, I know.
Accidentally climbed out of that narrow little tiny window.
The first supposedly, maybe he was, I don't know, bird watching. The first supposedly independent investigation had the worst explanation of all. Let's pan out. It may be that some people had the facts and knew that their name would be blackened and therefore chose not to share them. Perhaps some people were afraid of the ramifications for others. After all, people have long memories and people bring revenge sometimes. It may seem absurd to speculate about that this long after such an incident, but people hunted down those responsible for the deaths of relatives long after the events in the 20th century and into the 21st. So it's not completely unfeasible. And then, of course, the facts may simply no longer be available. If you had a few records about this at the highest level and you destroyed them, all of the people who were in charge of Czechoslovakia at the time are dead. The people who carried it out are likely dead. If it was carried out in the way that I'm implying, and there's no one left around to provide further corroborative evidence. These guys, you and I have talked in past shows about how the Nazis were such diligent record keepers, even about the most disgusting things. It was actually quite an illogical thing to do, and only because you're completely and psychopathically certain of your own immunity from punishment because you don't think what you're doing is wrong, do you write down the doing of such ghastly things? And most regimes, if they're bumping somebody off, try to keep it quiet. So there have been very limited written records. There's a time before media communications in the way that we might think about it today, and no emails or anything. People were unlikely to write down in their diaries that they'd killed the foreign minister that day. So what are we left with? Oral testimony, possibly recorded or written down. Well, it seems that nobody did it. Errant stray files in the secret intelligence materials. Well, almost every ex-Soviet regime's opened them up, and it doesn't look like there's anything there.
Yeah, a couple very significant echoes to today of this, and our viewers may not believe this, but we actually selected the story a couple of days ago. So just to pull back the curtain, it is my math problems aside, August 23rd August, as we tape this. And we selected this story a few days ago. And what's happened in the meantime is the daughter of a very prominent right-wing Russian official, strong supporter of Putin, sometimes called Putin's
that's
brain,
right,
has been killed in Russia. And the talk about Colombo's investigatory wizardry, the FSB, the new KGB, in 36 hours conclusively determined that this heinous murder was carried out by a Ukrainian agent who had subsequently absconded to Estonia, even though there are at least 5, 10, depending on how you count, 15 enemies of Putin who have been murdered, and those cases still aren't solved. Well, I think, as always, we've raised some questions and we've given some answers and we've had a good drink. Cheers.
Your health. Cheers.